For the next 30 minutes, myself and our company are going to try and tell you the history of the Wars of the Roses in 30 minutes. A war that lasted 35 years, saw the death of 4 kings, murder, execution, regicide and infanticide. England's real Game of Thrones. For 100 years, England had been fighting in France. But by the middle of the 15th century, England's glory days were long gone, and the victories under Henry V, England's great warrior king, were far behind them. England instead was ruled by his son, who had gained the throne as an infant baby, a man that had no resemblance to his father's warrior status. Henry VI was a pious man, a man that would prefer to read a book than wear armour, a man who was known to proud bouts of insanity.
Mais oui, il est en fou.
Embrace and take your crown. However, while Henry was weak, his French princess, his queen, Margaret of Anjou, was a strong and powerful woman. Shakespeare describes her as a she-wolf of France.
It's good being the she-wolf. It's good being the queen. I like being the queen.
But as I said before, England's war in France was going badly. And as a result of Henry's poor leadership, Parliament became polarised by 2 powerful lords. The first one was the Duke of Somerset, a loyal Lancastrian. The supporters and followers of Henry, these days are known as the Lancastrian cause. That term would not have been known during the period. Margaret and Henry had a son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Although rumours abound that the son was not the king's, but Somerset's instead.
That is despicable.
This is not hello.
I can do it if I like. That's a queen.
Opposing the Lancastrian faction in Parliament was a great warrior who had served in France. Himself, Richard, Duke of York. To this day, his followers obviously became the Yorkists, being the Duke of York. The Duke of York was a proud and noble man. And it is true, he actually had a claim to the throne through his mother's side. Some say his claim was greater than Henry's, whose forebears some consider usurped the throne. Richard had a large family, and will introduce you to 3 of his principal sons who will play a major part in what will follow next. His eldest son, Edward, Earl of March. George, Duke of Clarence. A drunkard and party animal, and one who should not be trusted. And the youngest son, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. You can boo now. Boo. No, not yet. York and Somerset, for many years, would argue vehemently in Parliament over how the war should be conducted. York was for continuing, but Somerset, based on the lack of finance in the English Exchequer, promoted that peace should be made with France. Matters continued for several years until 1453, of the last English field army was destroyed at the Battle of Castilion. The consequence of this was that the king went into a catatonic state. And whilst previously he had been ineffectual in controlling the crown, he was now totally unable to run the government in the country. For several years, the arguments and frustrations between York and Somerset continued. But the nobility sided with Somerset, and York was ostracised and alienated in Parliament. So York made the important decision that the only way he could wrest control of the government and run it the way he believed it should be was to take up arms, not against the king, but against those who he believed were the king's bad advisors. York, all of a sudden, gained a valuable ally. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, a powerful landowner with large lands and men. Somerset tried to impeach York for rebellion. And as a consequence, the two sides met at St Albans in 1455. During the vicious street fight, the Lancastrians were defeated, and the Duke of Somerset was killed fighting as a last stand outside the Castle Inn. The king was found gibbering on his horse and was taken into the authority.
You sit quietly now.
York and Warwick, with the king under their control, now attempted to run the country in his stead. However, although many Lancastrian nobles had been killed at St Albans, most of them had sons, and a new Duke of Somerset changed his hat. He goes to a few hat changes.
Just a little bit younger. I'd give it him back if I was. Try again.
And so once again, the two sides began arguing in Parliament until Henry recovered his senses, dismissed York and Warwick,
It was for you, my lord.
out of my court, and once again placed a new Duke of Somerset in control of Parliament. York now made an important decision. Having tried to wrest control of the crown by supporting the king under his own authority, York now decided to claim the throne for himself.
Again?
This outraged many of his own supporters, and it was generally conceived that if he continued in this manner, the country would fall into civil war. However, Parliament voted on what is called the Act of Accord. Rather than making York king, Parliament agreed that York would become the heir to the crown. So on the death of Henry, York would become king and his children would become heirs.
He's not dead yet. He's not dead yet.
This, however, infuriated Margaret of Anjou. The Act of Accord removed her own son, Edward of Lancaster, from the crown.
So much like his dad.
You are impugning my honor.
Yes, sir.
You are impugning my honor. It's not good. That's not fair, though.
So Margaret, Somerset, and the king withdrew to York in order to build a large army. In London, the Duke of York and Warwick both decided to take up the challenge, and both departed to their own lands to gather support.
Lots of men, yes.
However, York was impetuous, and York decided to march north before he had joined forces with Warwick. And in December, wait a minute. In December 1460, York spent Christmas at his castle in Wakefield. Seizing their opportunity, the Lancastrians' army, who vastly outnumbered York, marched on Wakefield. York was lured out by Lancastrian soldiers in the guise of Warwick troops. And in a brief engagement, York was surrounded, cut down and killed. Margaret and the king and the forces then marched on London. Warwick attempted to block the road to London and prevent Margaret entering the capital. But Warwick was a better politician than a soldier. Finding himself outmaneuvered and outflanked, Warwick was forced to flee the field. Unfortunately, London supported York and Warwick. So when Margaret reached the capital, she found the walls and gates closed against her.
Oh, excuse me, can I come in, please? Please, can I come in?
You speak for me.
This is not fair.
In February 1461, York's eldest son, Edward of March, heard the news of his father's death and immediately gathered an army, beat a Lancastrian force in Wales and joined forces with Warwick outside London. Faced with this new challenge and in the depths of winter, Margaret and her supporters were forced to withdraw back to York.
It's really cold here. It's not really warm down here.
York and Warwick entered London in victorious procession, and the council and parliament decided to give the crown to Edward, Earl of March. England now had two kings, Henry VI in London and the Yorkists. The Yorkists in London. Edward IV, sorry, Your Grace, and Warwick gathered once again a large army and marched north to take on the Lancastrian cause. On Palm Sunday, 1461, the two sides met in a small village outside Tadcaster.
I'm Howard.
What followed was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, fought in a snowstorm. And the Herald and Chronicles at the end of the day claim that 28,000 men died on that field.
I know you're winning still, it's all right. Yeah, okay.
Keep going.
The battle was fought throughout the day, and for a while the Lancastrians seemed to be having the advantage. However, late in the afternoon, Yorkist reinforcements under the Duke of Norfolk arrived on the battlefield and immediately attacked the Lancastrian flank.
Soldier number 2 comes in.
The Lancastrians were routed. Somerset fled the field and taken. Margaret and the king with them fled into exile in Scotland. Somerset, although in exile with many men, attempted to fight a border war. However, at the Battle of Hexham, he came across superior Yorkist forces, and the second Duke of Somerset in this period was cut down and executed after the battle.
Oh, this is going to get bad, isn't it?
This is becoming.
Don't worry, he's about to change his hats again. After the Battle of Hexham, Henry found himself alone and wandering around North Yorkshire. Until he was betrayed and taken into custody and taken to the Tower. Margaret and her son were forced to flee to France in exile. The Wars of the Roses should have ended in 1461. Edward was secure on the throne. Henry was in the Tower, and the Lancastrian nobles were either in exile or dead. Safe on the throne, Warwick decided that he needed to gain a noble princess for Edward's wife, and went to France to find himself. However, what Warwick didn't know is that 6 months before, and in secret, he married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner, a widow, and a Lancastrian. Their first husband had been killed at the Battle of St Albans. When Warwick returned with good news, because he found a princess,
I need to tell you something. While you've been away,
Warwick was enraged. And shortly afterwards, the king had 2 sons. But Warwick was not going to let matters sit as they did. And Warwick began plotting. With the king's brother, the Duke of Clarence. And together they changed sides. Warwick and Clarence sailed to France. And Warwick and Clarence begged forgiveness from Margaret and declared themselves for the Lancastrian throne. Shortly afterwards, Warwick and Clarence invaded the country.
You're for it now? I'll breathe on you.
Edward was caught by surprise. Unable to gather an army in time, he abandoned his wife and children in sanctuary with the crown and fled to Burgundy.
He's run up.
Warwick immediately went to the Tower, released Henry from prison.
was a right soap opera, wasn't
So good
it?
to see you.
And once again, Henry was back on the throne.
Lovely family film.
Portrait.
Etchings.
However, Edward did tarry in Burgundy with the support of the Duke of Burgundy and mercenaries. Edward very quickly returned back to the country.
You've got him spot.
He likes you.
Does he? Oh, I love you. You're marvellous.
Edward sent messengers to Clarence, giving him his forgiveness if he returned back to the family.
That's great. I love you.
It's not so good.
Margaret, leaving the king in London,
You stay here, dear. I'll be back.
travelled west to meet the new Duke of Somerset, who was sailing from France with reinforcements for the Lancastrian cause. In the meantime, Warwick held the city, and at Barnet, Your Grace, you need to. Your Grace, come on, keep up.
It's foggy. Can't see him.
Edward and his two brothers took on the Lancastrians under Warwick in a battle fought in the fog.
Harsh language. Right there somewhere. Oh!
The Yorkists outflanked the Lancastrians, and Warwick, while trying to flee the battlefield, was cut down and killed. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, Kingmaker, had paid the price for his disloyalty to Edward and was now dead.
Well, that's not a good thing, is it?
Edward immediately marched west to confront Margaret.
If you've got a job doing,
The two sides met in May 1471 at the Battle of Tewkesbury. At the beginning of the battle, Somerset charged violently into the Lancastrians,
please, thank you. Very good.
but the remainder of his men failed to move off the hill. And isolated, Somerset's men began to fall. With no opportunity, Somerset was forced to flee the battlefield and took sanctuary in Tewkesbury Abbey.
He totally ran away.
You're on your own, yeah.
The rest of the Lancastrians were routed.
Run away.
Wait a minute. Edward, the Lancastrian prince, who by this time was 18, he was like taller, was caught on the battlefield. Some accounts say he was killed in the fight. Other accounts say he was brought in front of the king.
My king.
Can I do it?
Gloucester. Another account showed that the Duke of Gloucester stabbed the prince to death.
He's still moving.
The following day, Yorkist troops stormed into the abbey and arrested Somerset.
I think
Somerset was dragged out and after a brief trial was executed.
You're guilty. You're guilty.
This time the Beaufort and the Duke of Somerset family had run out of hats. The Duke of Somerset line was extinguished.
We're doing pretty well. So kill more of them. Right.
Edward immediately sent Gloucester to London. With the prince gone, Margaret fleeing to France, he had one final piece of business to do. Henry was put to death in the Tower. My grace, you take your crown back.
Very good, very good. Oh, yes. Oh, dear.
You're right, your crown, my grace.
That was tragic.
Once again, the Wars of the Roses should have ended at this crucial moment in time. The Lancastrian cause was all but extinguished. There was a minor claimant by the name of Henry Tudor who had fled into exile after the Battle of Tewkesbury. We had little support and no money. A few years after Tewkesbury, however, Clarence, once again, began his machinations. And sick of his brother's treachery, Edward had his brother put to death, drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine.
What's an accident?
Have we got another one? He's drunk this one.
Edward sat safe on the throne.
You're dead now. What's that?
He had two sons. He had loyal supporters. And the country was in safe hands. But once again, the tide of fate would turn against the Yorkists. And in 1483, Edward, in his prime, died suddenly.
Joe, briefly.
Shuffle up there, shuffle up, Edward.
His eldest son, Edward, became king.
The king is dead. Long live the king.
Although Edward would never see his coronation day. Gloucester, his loyal uncle, who had been made protector of the crown, seized the young prince en route to London and took him into his custody. For his safe keeping, the young prince was placed in the Tower.
To the tower.
Yeah, his brother as well.
Oh, yeah, you
Elizabeth, who had taken her other son into sanctuary, initially refused to allow him to become into his uncle's possession. But finally, she agreed, and Gloucester now had control of both the princes.
Huzzah!
Good as far as I'm concerned.
Gloucester's most loyal supporter, the Duke of Buckingham, then went to Parliament and advised Parliament that the two princes were in fact illegitimate, and that there had been a previous marriage contract between Edward and another woman, which made his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid.
Yeah, definitely. Defo.
Gloucester was then offered the crown by Buckingham,
I'm having that.
and Gloucester accepted and became Richard III. Shortly after, any sights of the two princes were no longer seen.
Yeah, I'm bringing on a cushion for you. You're just going to have a nice sleepy. Okay, and a nice sleep, and down we go. There we go. There. I'll do my line now.
You can do your line now.
Thank you.
Now, it's the winter. I've had this content. Made glorious summer by this son of yours.
In truth, no one knows what happened to the princes in the Tower. But Gloucester's control, now Richard's control on the throne was tenuous. And many of Edward's loyal supporters were disenfranchised from the new king's power. In fact, Buckingham, very briefly afterwards, rebelled. Some say Buckingham had his eye on the throne himself, but Buckingham was captured in Salisbury and although begging Richard for his life, was executed.
On you go. No, you're going. You're going. There we go.
As I say, Gloucester's support was vanishing by the minute. And a young Welshman who was in exile in France became the centre of Lancastrian opposition to Richard. Not only did surviving Lancastrian nobles flock to Tudor standard, but many of the Yorkists who had been loyal to Edward also flocked to Tudor standard. Meanwhile in England, Tudor's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was married to a powerful landowner in the northwest, Lord Thomas Stanley. And Lord Thomas Stanley, who throughout the Wars of the Roses had managed to balance himself between the two sides, found himself in the position of power. His decision would determine what would happen next. In 1485, Tudor and his small army of English exiles and French mercenaries landed at Milford Haven and marched into England. Tudor's army was heavily outnumbered by Richard's. But Tudor attacked first, and his small army launched into Richard's vanguard. Bring it on! The two forward elements of the army fought a bitter contest for several hours. Stanley stood on the side and waited for his moment. Both Tudor and Richard called on Stanley to come to their aid. He continued to stay aloof. It's a crucial moment of the fighting. It's a crucial moment of fighting. Richard saw Tudor to the rear of the army with a small bodyguard, and mounting his horse with his personal bodyguard, launched one of the final medieval cavalry charges of the age. The charge is nearly successful. Richard killed Tudor's standard bearer.
Hello, Richard.
But at this most important moment, Stanley took his opportunity and charged into the rear of the York of Richard's bodyguard.
That's nice.
Richard was cut down in the fighting, and Stanley recovered the crown in the thorn bush. On the 22nd of August, 1485, a little-known French Welsh prince was crowned King Henry VII and ushered in the Tudor age. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Wars of the Roses, and however long it took. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for your cast.